Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs, je m'appelle Ann Cavoukian et je suis très heureuse d'être ici avec vous aujourd'hui. And I'm going to switch to English now so that you can understand what I'm saying. Or I could speak in Armenian, but I think the odds of that being understood would be even worse. I am delighted to be here, and I was so pleased to be invited. Let me just see if I can work this. Yes, okay. Now, whenever I have a captive audience, I always want to start by dispelling the myths which abound about privacy. Privacy is not about secrecy. It's not about having something to hide. I always say that could have been the motto of the Stasi police in the Third Reich when they said, well, if you're a law-abiding citizen, what's the problem with the state knowing everything about you? The problem is that that's not what freedom is about. We want freedom. We want privacy. Privacy is all about control. It's about personal control relating to the uses of your personal information. The Germans have a wonderful term for this called informational self-determination. It should be the individual who determines the fate of his or her personal information. And the reason for this is that context is key. Only the individual knows the sensitivity or lack thereof associated with some information. It's about them. They know the context. They have to be free to choose how that information is used. And I always have to remind people, privacy forms the foundation of our freedom. If you value freedom, you value privacy. Surveillance is the exact opposite. It's the antithesis of freedom, where all of your activities are known to everyone, and it leads to a shrinking of your cognitive bandwidth. Forgive me, I'm a psychologist, so I always think like that. But it makes you go inward. You don't have that blue sky thinking, wild ideas floating around, because you're always looking over your shoulder. People are looking at you. I don't know if you know this story about Steve Jobs, the brilliant Steve Jobs of Apple. He used to buy a new white Mercedes every 6 months, less a day, in California. Why, you might wonder. In California at that time, when you bought a new car, you had 6 months before you had to get a license plate. He didn't want a license number. He didn't want to be tracked. He just wanted to be free, free from surveillance, free from everything. Freedom was essential. Now, I'm going to talk to you just a little bit about privacy by design before I get into AI, artificial intelligence, which is everything I'm going to do. I call it the decade of privacy by design. I'll explain in a moment. I created privacy by design 20 years ago when I served as Privacy Commissioner of Ontario for 3 terms, a long time. And not being a lawyer, what I wanted was a different model of protecting privacy. I didn't want you to wait until the end, after the privacy harms had arisen, the data breach had taken place, and then apply the law and offer a remedy. No, I wanted to prevent the privacy harms from arising. I wanted a model of prevention. That's what privacy by design is all about, being proactive, building privacy, embedding it into the code, into your operations, into the data architecture, so that ideally the privacy infractions and data breaches would be avoided. I wanted like a medical model of prevention. And we had great success with it. In 2010, I mentioned to you that I was Privacy Commissioner. Privacy Commissioners have an international conference once a year. It's usually in Europe. In 2010, it was in Jerusalem. And at the end of a 3 or 4 day privacy conference, we have half a day closed session where commissioners are allowed to introduce resolutions that the entire assembly of data protection authorities can vote on. So that year, I introduced a resolution that we should have privacy by design as an international standard that could complement regulatory compliance, which always comes after the fact. I wanted something, as I said, before, upfront, ideally to avoid the harms from arising. And I was amazed that it was unanimously passed as an international standard. Because most commissioners are what I call lawyers. They're brilliant. They love applying Section 29, Part 2, Sub A to the fact situation and getting a wonderful result. But what I learned after speaking to them, they, like I did, understood that in this growing day, at this stage of massive social media abounding, ubiquitous computing, digital, everything online, we no longer had the ability to protect people's privacy. The majority of the harms were remaining largely unknown, unchallenged, unregulated. Much like the commissioners, we were only seeing the tip of the iceberg, and that wasn't acceptable. So we decided that we needed privacy by design upfront proactively to complement regulatory compliance after the fact, which we felt was no longer sustainable in and of itself to ensure a future of privacy. And we've had great luck. It's been translated into 40 languages. When I was commissioner, not a week would go by when I wouldn't hear from some country telling me what they were doing. It was very exciting. There are two essentials to privacy by design. I've talked about the first one, being proactive, upfront. You want to prevent the harm from arising, protect privacy. The other is abandon zero-sum models. Zero-sum means you can only have a positive gain in one area, security, always to the detriment of the other area, privacy, so that the two total to a sum of zero. It's win, lose, either or, you can't have both. Nonsense, throw this out. It is so yesterday. What I want you to do is abandon zero-sum and embrace what's called positive sum. Positive sum in game theory just means you can have two positive gains at the same time. Privacy and security, privacy and marketing, privacy and data utility. You can have both. And the end result is so much better. But I wanted to make sure that what I was asking was doable. So one year, I went around talking almost exclusively to engineers, data scientists, tech people all around the world, and I said, look, I'm saying you can bake this into the code, into the data architecture. I want to make sure you can do that. Can you do that? Every engineer, data scientist, everyone I spoke to said, of course we can do it. You know, we're smart. They're confident. That's what you want. But the problem, as they told me, Bruce Schneier is one of my dear friends and colleagues. He's a brilliant cryptographer. And he said, Ann, it's ridiculous. It's a false dichotomy, this one versus the other. It consists of unnecessary trade-offs. Of course we can do both, but we're not the problem. They're the problem. I said, who's the problem? They said, the guys asking us to write the code and develop the programs. We get the instructions to write the code for a particular program. We write it, we deliver it. And then someone says, oh, can you bolt on a privacy solution after the fact? And they said, you know, give me a break. We can do something. It's never going to be as good as if it was seamlessly integrated into the entire program from the beginning. Made so much sense to me. So after that, I went around talking to CEOs and boards of directors, and I said, get rid of the silos. You can't just have legal over here talking to policy, delivering it over here to tech after the fact. No, get rid of it. You have to talk to each other at the same time and make sure you have a unified goal. And we've had great success with this. I don't have enough time to go through this in great detail. There are 7 foundational principles to privacy by design. Go to my website. There's a lot of information on it. I'm going to focus on just 2 things. I've talked about the first one. You have to prevent the harms from arising. Embedded in design speaks for itself. Let me talk about the second principle. Privacy is the default setting. This is a game changer, big time. Because right now, what you're expected to do, if you want privacy, you're expected to go, wade through all the legalese and the terms of service, go through the privacy policy, search for the opt-out box that says, do not use my information for any other purpose other than the primary purpose of the data collection. I mean, we know nobody does that. You know, life is short, but it doesn't mean that people don't care deeply about privacy. In the last 2 years, all of the public opinion polls have come in at the 90 percentile, Pew Internet Research and others, meaning 90% of those surveyed are very deeply concerned about their privacy. 92% say they're very concerned about loss of control over their information. So huge, huge concern for privacy. Trust at an all-time low. There is such a trust deficit. Privacy as the default flips that on its head. It says, no, no, we don't expect you to go and search for the opt-out box to give negative consent. No, no, we give you privacy automatically as the default setting. You don't have to ask for it. We give it to you. We are only allowed to use the information you provide for the primary purpose of the data collection, the purpose it was intended. I mean, you don't give people your information and say, do whatever the heck you want with it. No, no, we will only use for the purpose intended. Later on, if there's a secondary use that arises, we will come back to you and seek your positive consent for that information. Total game changer. This builds trust like no other. And so many companies have come back and told me that it builds loyalty. They retain their customer base who remains loyal. It attracts new opportunity. They gain a competitive advantage by doing this. It's a true win-win. It works every time. And just in case you think maybe that sounds interesting, but it's just a theoretical construct, au contraire. This paper, which you can find on my website, consists of 22 papers. It's a compilation of 22 papers we wrote with all of the leading tech companies. Think of any tech company: Microsoft, Intel, HPE, Oracle, IBM. I know I'm leaving a bunch out. We wrote papers with them on all of these areas to show that, yes, you can do privacy and smart meters, privacy and sensors, privacy and, not privacy versus. It's absolutely critical that you understand this is ever so doable, and it's preferable because it attracts opportunity, it keeps your customers happy, it's a true win-win. You may know that it was a year ago, it was the birthday now, last Friday, of the GDPR, the new law introduced a year ago in the European Union called the General Data Protection Regulation, which raises the bar on privacy dramatically. And to my delight, they included my privacy by design framework. It's in the GDPR, and specifically privacy as the default. This is such a game changer, I can't tell you. Ever since the GDPR has been enacted, and countries all around the world are trying to comply and create laws of their own that are essentially equivalent to the GDPR because they want to continue to be able to engage in trade with the EU. Business is very important. You've got to be able to exchange information. And I would not be so bold as to say this, but Information Age a few years ago said it's not too much of a stretch to say that if you implement privacy by design, you've mastered the GDPR. I assure you, there's much more to the GDPR than privacy by design. But I think this shows the sentiment that countries like ours, because our law is no longer essentially equivalent with the GDPR, which is so unfortunate. We've always enjoyed essential equivalence. Canada has with the EU, unlike the US that has never enjoyed it. They've never had strong laws like that. Not anymore. So companies have been racing to show that they're doing privacy by design, and they want to show the EU that they're acting out of good faith. Absent a law requiring it, they're doing what they can by following the 7 foundational principles of privacy by design. So again, it's becoming a real win-win. And our government, federal government, 2 years ago, our federal privacy commissioner, Tyranny, went to the government and said, look, our law is no longer equivalent to the new GDPR. We have to raise the bar. Our federal private sector legislation, PIPEDA, was enacted in the early 2000s. It's dated. We need to upgrade it, and we need to add privacy by design to it because it was created by one of ours, Ann Cavoukian, and they have it and we don't. So the government responded last February with a report. The title was Towards Privacy by Design. So I'm optimistic that if they ever get around to doing this, they'll include privacy by design. I'm going to turn to AI now because that's such a growing field that has to be examined. What faith can we place in AI? How can we place our confidence in it? These are some of the concerns you're going to be hearing a lot because we don't know how it operates. We have to look under the hood, as I call it. We have to examine this very, very carefully. And so many people are examining it. I should tell you, before I continue, just in the last few days, last week, the OECD has put out a set of principles on artificial intelligence. 42 countries have accepted the OECD principles that attempt to improve transparency, fairness, accountability, things of that nature. And it's the first of its kind for AI by the OECD. The OECD, of course, they came up with, in 1980, fair information practices on which most privacy laws all around the world are based. So they're hoping that their principles will literally have the same effect. I didn't have time to prepare a slide for this on the weekend, but I will talk about it. This is some of the discussions that have been happening in the last few years. When algorithms discriminate, people are very concerned about what are algorithms actually doing. How can we be assured of the fact that they're not becoming a tyranny in terms of tyranny of the algorithms? Let me just explain how AI works very briefly. Algorithms are developed that create the way artificial intelligence works, but those algorithms are created on the basis of the data sets that are used to inform them. Data sets consist of massive amounts of data reflecting whatever the area is that is being examined. So if you don't have, when I say look under the hood, it's not good enough just to look at the algorithm. That would be meaningless, first of all, to most people, including myself. But even if someone explains it, a tech person who's working in AI, that's not good enough. You have to dig further and examine the training data sets which were used to develop the AI algorithm. That's critical because the content of the data sets will determine the accuracy or lack thereof, or the bias or lack thereof of the algorithms. And I'll give an example in just a moment. Very concerned, as I said, about the tyranny of algorithms. And there has been a massive call for algorithmic transparency. As I said, usually it hasn't gone far enough in my view in terms of wanting to take it back to look at the data sets, but we'll be getting there soon. And the concern for bias associated with AI is growing dramatically because now we have some actual concrete examples of how that bias is taking place. And I'm going to talk about a case that was before the Supreme Court of Canada last year. And it is an amazing example. This Indigenous character, a Métis individual, who was up for parole. He was in prison, he was up for parole. So Correctional Services Canada applied an algorithm to his case to see if he would be high rate of recidivism, if he would be a good candidate to recidivate, in which case, obviously, you wouldn't want to give him parole. And they applied the algorithm, and they found that, yeah, they said, yeah, he's gonna do it again. He's gonna be someone who is prone to recidivism, so they did not grant him parole. His lawyer, brilliant lawyer, really looked at this very carefully, and he did go back to the data sets used for the algorithms. And what they found was that the data sets bore no reflection to this individual who is Métis. He comes from an Indigenous background, and the population of the data sets, the individuals who populated the data sets, there weren't any Indigenous characters. So he said, that can't be applied to me. I am not the same as the populations they looked at. That's why it's unfair, and I want it revoked. The Supreme Court of Canada, unbelievably, I was delighted, agreed. And they said, you can't do this. It's not possible to have other populations, other information determine the fate of this individual. Obviously, that's unfair, but the assumptions coded in the algorithm create biases that lead to inaccurate predictions. And it was a brilliant conclusion, and this was just last year. So I think real gains are going to be made because we're going to be following this increasingly to look under the hood of artificial intelligence in a meaningful way to ensure that bias doesn't proliferate. Remember, AI is just coming into its head. I mean, a couple of years ago, we weren't talking about AI like this, unless you were actually in the area, but now we are. And a little while ago, they said privacy by design is key to the future of artificial intelligence. So I decided, since I created privacy by design, it was time to extend it to AI. And that's what I did. I created something called AI Ethics by Design. And I'd love to spend a few hours with you on this. Regrettably, I think I have 5 minutes left. So I'm going to just say that if you look at the kinds of things we're talking about, everyone is talking about transparency, responsibility, accountability. But as I like to tell my students and others, it has to be meaningful. Transparency cannot just extend to the algorithms. You have to look at the data sets. You have to make sure there's algorithmic oversight. in order to ensure responsibility. Of course, privacy must be respected, data protection, data governance by design always. And by design just means it's not an accident you're doing this, you have proactively intended to proceed in this manner. And it makes the outcome, the results, much better, clearly fairer. And of course, you have to document everything, address security. So take a look at this and you'll get just some understanding of it. Now, there's a lot of groups now that are looking at developing guidelines for ethics, et cetera, for AI. I mentioned just a minute ago that the OECD has just put out a set of, I think it's 6 guidelines, and that's been signed by 42 countries all around the world. The European Commission also developed guidelines for trustworthy AI, and you can take a look at these. All of these, of course, you have access to my slides, and you can look up any of these in greater detail. And the IEEE, of course, they're in it, global initiatives on ethics in terms of autonomous and intelligent systems. You're going to get a lot of autonomous vehicles now that are going to be happening, driving by themselves, so you better have good ethics in there. These are some of the concerns we have to address, and I just want to bring them to your attention so that you know that we can do this. It is ever so doable, and we must do it now. I'm going to end by just telling you a little more of the work I'm doing. Privacy by design has taken off because it's included in the GDPR now, but I've also expanded my work. I've created an international council on global privacy and security by design because I want to emphasize the need for and as opposed to versus, to get rid of the zero-sum privacy versus security. Because you see, what always happens, especially when there's an increase in terrorist incidents, dating back to Charlie Hebdo, Paris, San Bernardino, on, the pendulum always swings back to, forget about privacy, we need security, we need safety. Of course we do, but not to the exclusion of privacy. You can do both, and we have hundreds of examples of how you can do both. So I always like to repeat that, and I created this international council. It's a not-for-profit to raise much-needed research funding so that people can show how you can do privacy and security or whatever, and that positive sum model is very important. We have an amazing board of directors, founding members, Darren Entwistle, who is the head, the CEO of TELUS, one of our major telcos. Michael Chertoff, you may recall, was the second Secretary of Homeland Security. I worked with him when I was commissioner. When I asked him if he would consider doing this, he said yes right away. Of course, Anne, we have to have privacy and security. Jill de Kirchhoff is the Director of Counterterrorism in the EU. You might think he would just say, no, it's just about security. No, it's about both. So this goes on and on. We've had great success with this. And if you have any interest, please go to the website, gpsbydesign.org, and take a look at the information. I would love to have you look at it. So I'm going to end, ladies and gentlemen, just by reminding you of how very important it is to do both. You must have privacy and security. If you do it proactively, you will gain so many advantages, and you will avoid the regulator coming knocking at your door after you have a data breach or a privacy infraction. And if you have any interest, I tweet every morning between 5:30 and 6 a.m. the latest stories of the day. Many of them come from Europe. My husband is a saint. But if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can see what are the latest stories of the day. It's just at Ann Cavoukian. And what I want to do, I want to leave you with the thought that you never give up. I assure you, I get many people who say, look, privacy's gone. You can't get it back. Genie's out of the bottle. I say, the hell you can't get it back. Get another bottle. Forget about that genie. We can do this. We have to do this. Privacy forms the foundation of our freedom. Nothing is more important. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen.